All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for coming today. We have a great guest here who is actually also a faculty member at UT Law. Sina Kian is VP of Strategy at Aleo, a very innovative blockchain startup that just raised $1 gazillion in a funding round. Maybe you can tell us about that later. They are building, and he will tell us what this means, a decentralized blockchain that uses cryptography to provide significantly enhanced data security and privacy capabilities. That all sounds lovely. Hopefully we can learn what it means. He's also a fellow here in the Strauss Center on our program on technology, security, and global affairs. And as I mentioned, is currently teaching a course here at UT Law on crypto law and policy, which is a great innovative course offering. And because it was oversubscribed, and also to give our community members a piece of the action, we decided to hold this event so that everyone could get a chance to hear from Sina while he's here. A little more about his background. It's in law, policy, and finance. He's a graduate of Stanford Law School, and after that, he was a law clerk on the DC Circuit for 2 years for Judge Thomas Griffith and Judge David Tatel, and then on the Supreme Court for Chief Justice John Roberts. He then practiced law at Wilmer Hale, and after that, transitioned from law to an investing role. He worked at Blackstone and at another fund called Kennedy Lewis, where he did technology investing, and that all led him to his current role in the technology sector. So before we get started, I just want to provide an event notice. We'll be having another Strauss Center event on Thursday in this room. That will be me and Professor Chesney, who just joined us, talking about careers in national security law, 5 things you need to know. The listicle, BuzzFeed style listicle there. And that will be starting at 11:50 to 12:50 in this room, primarily for law students, but anyone who wants is welcome to join. We will be introducing a new program that the Strauss Center has called the National Security Law Student Fellows. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, please come on out. And of course, we will be providing lunch as well. We never let you go hungry. Okay, with that, Sina Kian, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And we're going to do this as sort of a Q&A fireside chat. Why don't we start? Maybe you can explain what crypto is for people who aren't that familiar with it. How do cryptocurrencies relate to blockchains? Just a bit of a basic introduction to the tech.
Yeah, so a cryptocurrency is the native digital token associated with the blockchain. And so it's important to know what the blockchain itself is. And the blockchain is basically an algorithm that does some function. Now, the way Bitcoin works, which is like the first prominent public blockchain, is it allows people to transfer money peer-to-peer without an intermediary. And so what it's doing is it's replacing the intermediary that historically has been something like a bank with an algorithm. But the algorithm needs resources, and specifically it needs processing power. And so to incentivize people to provide that processing power, it issues a native token. In the case of Bitcoin, that cryptocurrency is just called a Bitcoin. And that token is the thing that people can transfer. And so subsequent blockchains are basically doing the same thing. And so there are basically 2 ways to think about a blockchain. The first is what most people are referring to, which is an algorithm that incentivizes some provision of processing power or other resources being provided to it by issuing a token. And the second one is just as a ledger. So you can imagine, for example, a central bank having a ledger where it just maintains a digital currency. And you could call that a cryptocurrency because it's cryptographically protected, but it does not rely on an algorithm. It's actually relying on a central bank.
So why don't, maybe sometimes an example is helpful to crystallize things. Let's just start with the simplest possible example of what a blockchain might do. And then why can't you do that without having a cryptocurrency that's associated with that blockchain?
Yeah, I think there's a good reason why Bitcoin was the first, even though financial functionality is very complicated. So what Bitcoin does is it allows anyone who owns a Bitcoin to transfer that or any portion of it to a subsequent user without having a trusted intermediary provide that service. So why is that important? Well, it depends on how you're thinking about it. First, from a cost structure perspective, you think about banks. They own real estate. They have entire employment cost structures, and they have their own incentives. So the idea that we can replace the entirety of what Bank of America is doing from a Zelle perspective.
You mean from transferring money?
Transferring, yeah. With an algorithm, at least from a cost perspective, seems interesting. There's also like a philosophical angle to it, which is, do you actually trust these third parties? And historically, these third parties have given us a lot of reason not to trust them, which is why banking is one of the most regulated practices out there. And so if you don't trust them, or you wish to have to trust them less, something like Bitcoin is very interesting.
So Bitcoin obviously is just about money, but other blockchains are not just about money. So let's say we're talking about our ledger. Everyone has heard of NFTs. We'll get to that later. But a piece of digital art, and somebody's keeping a ledger that's authoritative of who owns that art. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Why do you need a cryptocurrency associated with a blockchain that's doing something like that, keeping records of who owns art? That's not obviously something we would think of as money. It's more just a record-keeping function. Can you explain what role a cryptocurrency would play in that setup?
Yeah, so if you have, for example, an NFT, which is a digital token that references a piece of art, blockchains are performing several roles there. First of all, it's an immutable ledger that has a record of ownership. So, for example, if you look at the real world where you have real estate titles, there is real estate title insurance that you pay when you buy a house. It's very costly because it's very costly to keep up these ledgers. So we can remove part of that cost structure by putting it onto a blockchain. That's one thing. The second thing is what Bitcoin solved and what the NFTs are taking advantage of is this concept of digital scarcity. Before Bitcoin, one of the biggest problems we have with the concept of digital money and what computer scientists struggled with is that if I sent you $5 digitally, how do you know I didn't copy paste it and keep it for myself? And
because anything digital is just a series of ones and zeros.
Exactly. And that's basically what happened with music. If you think back to the era of Napster, people would send songs and retain them. And so the value of music plummeted arguably to zero in a sense under that regime because there's no scarcity. What this does is it enforces scarcity. So we know ownership.
And why do you need a cryptocurrency to do that? If we're just keeping records of who owns a song, why do we need a cryptocurrency that seems unrelated? Can you explain how it's related?
Yeah, so the only other way to do it is to have one party own it. And in a lot of contexts, if one party owns it, that means, there are network effects to these things.
So that's Apple Music, for
Apple Music, for example. So you have empowered one corporation with a tremendous amount of leverage because they are who you have to go through to transact. And the real life consequences of this are profound almost anywhere you look. So take, for example, music rights. So if someone's keeping track of music rights, they make sure you're paid, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at Spotify, the cost structure of Spotify is designed so that for every million listens, about $4,000 goes to the label and the artist, of which about only 10 to 20% goes to the artist. So if you're an artist under this regime, you are getting about 400 to 800, maybe more if you're a big artist, per million listens. And that's the squeeze of that cost structure. If you can remove aspects of it and have a less costly ledger in which music rights are easily transferable and payments flow through a blockchain, what you can see is a lot more of that can be passed on to the artist, which is why musicians and artists are, I think, one of the first fronts outside of computer science. You're seeing a lot of excitement in these communities in particular because they see the value of where this may go.
And so let's stick with our hypothetical music example. We don't like Spotify. I have Spotify, but we don't like Spotify hypothetically. But we don't like Apple Music because they're taking all the money. They've got the network effects. They can censor people. Let's say we agree that the centralized world is bad. We want to switch to this decentralized blockchain world that you're talking about. But of course, Spotify provides servers. Spotify has lawyers. Spotify does all kinds of other things. How are we going to do these things in the blockchain, on the blockchain?
Yeah, when we talk,
who's going to provide the servers?
It's a great question. When we talk about the blockchain, we're talking about a whole universe of things. And one of the most interesting fronts is just how do we automate things that aren't automated already? And so payments processing is actually ripe for automation because you can imagine the code even as a non-computer scientist. If played, send money to X recipient. And X recipient could then fractionalize and split that up more. So one of the places where we need innovation is actually figuring out that code and what that automation looks like, and then moving folks onto that blockchain. Now, as you said, the blockchain itself needs some sort of processing power in order to work, and that's where these cryptocurrencies come in, because people can earn them through the protocol, through its tokenomics, by providing that power. So what do people do in Bitcoin? Originally, it was your laptop. Now it's very specialized ASIC servers. They plug them in. They connect to the Bitcoin protocol. Your servers are providing the processing power to mine transactions and to effectuate transactions, and you're getting paid out of the protocol. It produces Bitcoin and gives it to you.
So that's the link between a cryptocurrency and a blockchain. Blockchain is performing some function, but you need people to provide the processing power. And so the cryptocurrency is the reward for performing the processing power. So to extend that to our music situation, let's say I want to start the music blockchain that's going to replace Spotify. Who's doing what? What function is my cryptocurrency performing? Do I need one to make this work? And who's getting paid out for it?
Yeah, and to be clear, I have nothing against Spotify. I think it's a great company. They are basically trapped in how music rights work.
Okay, we've excused Spotify. That's fine.
So it's not like they're mad at artists or something.
Okay, they're nice, but now we're replacing them. Let's replace them.
So there's short term what's happening, and long term what I think is really interesting. Short term, obviously, artists are experimenting with NFTs. What is an NFT? It's a non-fungible token that is associated with the artist and can be verified as associated with the artist. So what can you do as an artist? You can say, hey, my closest fans will buy the first 1,000 of my NFTs. And by the way, if you have that, you get preferential access to my concerts. Maybe you get to meet me after the concert. That's a way to monetize. So we're talking about changing the business model of music to find more ways to monetize for artists. That's the short term. That's already happening now. Long term, what I think would be interesting is if a company like Spotify connected its back operations to a blockchain such that when someone played a song, you, through a smart contract, automatically pay the artist. And then what I think is even more interesting than that is a world where the artist can fractionalize those rights and sell them. So let's just like wave a wand and say that happened. In the kind of cliche where there is an artist playing in some venue and an agent approaches them and says, "Oh, you got talent, I'm going to make you a star." Instead of that agent, you can imagine that artist selling music rights, revenue rights to early fans who then become promoters de facto, right? The way people like to share music already is, hey, I listened to this amazing song by a new band, check it out. Well, you could also put your money where your mouth is, buy the rights to the song if you think it's going to do well, and then you have a financial incentive to be part of the artist's story. So very long term, you can almost imagine like a stock market of songs, where you say, oh, I think this song is undervalued relative to where it'll end up. I think the song is overvalued, I'll sell it. Now that presupposes an entire regulatory regime and a legal regime that facilitates it, but you can imagine assets having that kind of transferability.
Before we go on, I think maybe just a quick raise of hands so we can get a sense. How many of you actually own any cryptocurrency? All right, pretty good. Okay. And how many of you have read, let's put it, a moderate amount about cryptocurrency? Okay, more than own it. Interesting. What can we derive from that difference? Okay, great. That's really helpful. So I think that's great. Before we move on to the role of law and lawyers, which I think we're about to get to, why do you think this has the potential? How big do you think this has the potential to be? Can you talk about some other examples where you think this technology has the potential to be really disruptive? And just to get to the point, why do you think this is potentially much better than this existing centralized models that that dominate all kinds of industries and forms of social organization.
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally transformative. I'll give you kind of a small example that actually scales really well. Recently, in a speech, Undersecretary of Treasury Wally Adeyemo said that there's like 200 million plus people who send remittances of $200 or $300 to families in other or whoever in other countries. Right now, you're paying 7% or so, maybe more, of a transaction cost on that. So for a $300 transfer, you're paying $21 to transfer that. And if you're transferring $300, probably safe to say $21 is a meaningful chunk of that to you. Crypto can collapse that. The number for that transaction post crypto is close to zero, very close to zero. That's what's currently underway, and I think it's totally possible. And if crypto does nothing other than facilitate that, I think its wealth ramifications for people who need it the most are very, very significant. I think one of the harder challenges for crypto that long term is very interesting is actually referencing real world assets on a blockchain. Because everything I said right now requires the assets to literally be on the blockchain or on a blockchain that can be referenced from.
When you say on the blockchain, you mean they are a digital asset that whose ownership is stored on and recorded on a blockchain.
Yeah, that's right. So Bitcoin only tracks Bitcoin. It doesn't track US dollars, it doesn't track anything else, just Bitcoin. So you can imagine a world where you say, okay, let's put real estate titles on a blockchain. Now, the process of doing that, given local regulations, given all the obstacles, that's not something that I expect to see happen in the next few years, but it's something that's very interesting. And then you start thinking, where else do we have ledgers that would benefit from automation? Where else in supply chains? Where else in how companies operate would automation help? And I think it leads me to a point that I really want to emphasize, which is like crypto is just one front of automation. And it's using these like native tokens to incentivize people to do something that's helpful for that automation. Because, you know, until you have like the robot that's like solar powered and has enough power, even if the sun goes away, it can do everything on itself. Like you need people to participate even in algorithms doing these functions. And so,
so just to push back a little bit here, Amazon manages the supply chain pretty well. It doesn't seem like there's a major need within Amazon for a blockchain to improve its supply chain management, or Walmart.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in many contexts, a centralized third party will be a more efficient manager than a blockchain will. So I think the key question for anyone thinking about this is, what are the benefits of a blockchain? What are the benefits of, for example, decentralization? And there's a big difference between a centralized blockchain where, for example, one sovereign nation has the only node that is doing the validating versus a decentralized one.
Node that is doing the validating. Can you explain that for anyone who's not tracking there?
Yeah.
These are the people who plug their servers in and conduct transactions for the network in exchange for compensation.
Yeah. So if an authoritarian government is interested in a CBDC,
can you explain what that is?
That's a central bank digital currency.
Right. So this is putting the US dollar or the renminbi on a blockchain instead of having it in some other kind of ledger that's managing accounts.
Yep. And so hypothetical authoritarian government, they are not going to be interested in miners validating transactions. They're going to want control over the entire thing. They'll block certain transactions they don't like, censor certain addresses they don't like. They want to be very involved in regulating which transactions go through. There are other contexts in which, so that's the context in which one entity will decide that it wants centralized control. But there are other contexts in which decentralization is its own virtue. And generally speaking, it will be non-governments deciding they want decentralization as opposed to governments which are inherently centralized.
Okay, let's switch to the legal realm here a little bit, because we are at a law school. Hopefully we have many law students here. Hopefully some of them are thinking about this as a potential career. What law applies to crypto? You're teaching a course on this right now, but There's no textbook called crypto law. So which bodies of law are relevant and in what proportion?
Yeah, I think that's one of those questions where the answer is going to change based on context. But there is so much opportunity right now in operating rules for law to play a fundamental part. And I kind of divided my head into two sets of kind of legal issues. The first is dealing with complying with laws that exist now. One of the biggest fronts there is the securities laws. So what I just described with the music rights absolutely looks and probably is a security if done the way I described it. So thinking through what compliance with the securities laws means in that context is an obvious one and a very, very big one. There are also anti-money laundering laws. So obviously money laundering is concerned with taking illegitimate cash and putting it into the economy. So if you are issuing cryptocurrencies and you're facilitating something like that, you're going to be in trouble. So you need to figure out what processes help you comply with the Bank Secrecy Act if it applies, or other laws concerned with anti-money laundering. There's also obviously sanctions laws. So sanctions is really, really interesting because generally speaking, there are certain sanctioned entities, people, whatever, where if you're just issuing Bitcoin, you don't necessarily know if you're a miner, if you got your server plugged in, whose transactions you're running. So lawyers are needed to help policymakers think through what's possible here, and if our old regulatory structures don't work, how we can address important regulatory goals in a way that also encourages innovation.
And I know you have thoughts on how we might do that. Maybe we'll push that into the Q&A if people are interested in it. Let's talk about the law and the role of lawyers a little bit more. One phenomenon that's pretty intriguing is DAOs, which are decentralized autonomous organizations. And for those who don't know, this is a way of assembling a group of people using smart contracts, automatically executing contracts in code on the blockchain together behind some kind of collective goal through crypto. Can you explain a little bit more about what these things can do, what law applies to them? Are the smart contracts themselves actual legal contracts as we would understand them, and so forth?
Yeah.
Why are these disruptive?
It's an easier question to answer now than it will be in the future, in part because right now many DAOs, decentralized autonomous organization, many of them are neither decentralized nor particularly autonomous. To the extent they become more autonomous, it's more interesting. But right now, the biggest question that comes up, I'm involved in a couple of DAOs, and the biggest question I see come up is how liability works. So an LLC limits liability for individuals to the money they invested in the LLC itself. Very, very important legal innovation for encouraging risk-taking in the private sector. DAOs don't have that. And so what a lot of DAOs do now is they form an LLC with the original members, and then the DAO sits in it as something that's happening. Now, what's interesting about that? What's the first thing that you think of is like, well, what if you're not in the LLC? Like, you have to make sure people have that limited liability and what that looks like. So Wyoming passed a fairly limited solution to this, which basically treats DAOs as some version of LLC. So you can register your DAO in Wyoming. No one else has. Many states are actively looking into it. Again, if you go back to the history of the LLC, it was enterprising lawyers who actually understood the value of this and pushed it from a policy perspective in many states. And one lawyer in particular, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, is responsible for why Delaware now is the home of many LLCs, because this individual recognized the importance of these from an economic perspective and got Delaware to be a friendly haven for filing them.
So corporate law and corporate governance is designed to solve a bunch of principal agent problems, right? You have the officers of a company and employees of a company doing certain things on behalf, in theory, hopefully, of the owners of the company or the shareholders. When you have that separation of ownership and control, you have principal agent problems. How do DAOs deal with this? Is code the solution to this?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a solution to it, but it often is a substitute. So when you think about like the bank example with Bitcoin, banks do what they do through principal agent relationships. So they have, CEO who hires like chief of marketing, hires someone to do compliance, hires someone to do this. Bitcoin does away with all of that. It just says for this function of keeping the ledger and helping people transfer Bitcoin, it's just going to be this algorithm.
What do you mean by this, Al? Can you explain that?
It's going to be the Bitcoin algorithm.
Which means you get paid this much if you validate a transaction according to these rules.
That's right. Okay. That's right. And the algorithm has its own token economics, which is what you're referring to. You'll get paid this much. After so and so years, you'll get paid this much. And over time, transaction costs are actually how you incentivize miners to pay. So it's got this regime to incentivize people to participate. That is in lieu of principal agents, largely speaking. Now, that's the first wave. And I don't think it's.
And so, to give an analogy here, Amazon, to get someone to come to work in its warehouse or to be its chief of marketing, needs to figure out what the market clearing rate is for someone of the quality they desire to come and take that job. Whereas in Bitcoin or another blockchain, the algorithm is set up to generate a payment that will induce someone to come in and provide processing power to the network. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, that's right. So to take one easy way to contrast is Uber will pay drivers to be drivers on the network so that people come and use the Uber software as an algorithm to have Uber drivers kind of move them around. You can imagine a world now where instead of it being Uber the company, it's Uber the algorithm. And the algorithm pays Uber drivers in Uber coins, right? And then when people use Uber, they pay the Uber drivers in Uber coins. And you kind of work out the economics there to bootstrap the network the same way Uber did. But the amazing thing about this is the distributional consequence. So with Uber, the company, the billionaires are the early investors and the founders, right? And the early employees, maybe. In Uber, the algorithm powered by crypto, the drivers are the beneficiaries because they're being paid in the Uber coins, and the Uber coins value is a function of the network. And so stepping back, fundamentally what's going on is that we're bootstrapping networks by sharing the wealth of the networks with the participants. You own Bitcoin, you participate in the wealth of Bitcoin, the network, right? So likewise in Uber, it's it will be the drivers and the people who participate who are the ones who actually make the wealth from the network success.
So this is all very exciting, but there's also obviously, I think it's fair to say, a lot of BS, hype, scammy behavior around crypto. How do we as observers separate the scammy BS from the real innovation?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think first you have to understand the incentives that what I'm talking about creates. So, okay, you watched Bitcoin do what it did. It's become multi-$100 billion network, at times $1 trillion network. So other people basically will say, all right, I'm going to copy paste Bitcoin. We'll change a few things and we'll make it a little bit better, right? And then if you're a holder, you're like, if we succeed, we can make a lot of money. So you're very incentivized to promote the success of any network in which you hold coins because the wealth of the network is shared with you. So we can talk about the brilliance of it first and then get to why it leads to also like the scammy behavior. I mean, the brilliance is Bitcoin doesn't need a chief marketing officer because everyone who holds it goes around telling people, look how great it is. It works, it's secure, it's this and that. And what you see organically online is an almost annoying amount of people talking about how great it is because they're holders, they believe in it, and they believe in something they own, and they're telling you how great it is. By the same incentives lead other people to try to push other memes. And when that meme goes from like interesting, fun, like internet thing to illegitimate kind of scam is a very fact-specific question. It's hard to get into because people at elite institutions like University of Texas can say, oh, a dog coin, like who cares? But in many ways, if you go back to the philosophy of crypto here, it's a lack of trust in particular centralized intermediaries. And what you're seeing is communities come up and say, we will not be told from the top down what is interesting, what is meme-worthy, what we can pay with. And so things like Dogecoin, which maybe up front you would have thought, hey, this is silly, what's the point of this? We already have Bitcoin, actually have fairly robust communities. Now, will those communities last? I don't know. But it's hard to say ex ante, and I think foolish to regulate ex ante who is legitimate, who is not. I think you have to look for certain behaviors which we're kind of used to looking for in the law and regulatory world, which is like fraud, deception, things like that, and use that as your guide for what's legitimate and what's not.
Let's address specifically our students who may be thinking about getting into this. Should they think about getting into this as lawyers? If so, what should they study? And third, how much technical knowledge do they need?
Yeah,
let's start with should first.
I think this is enormously exciting. And the reason I think it's exciting from a legal and policy perspective is that the legal angle is a really important part of the business decisions. So at any of these startups or any of these businesses thinking about getting into crypto, the person in the law seat is there for all the business decisions. I don't think that's true necessarily for like biotech. I mean, you help them go through like the FDA process or whatever, but you're not really a part of the business. Here, the product itself may well be shaped by how you decide to comply with certain laws. And I think that makes the legal role an important one, and when it's important, it tends to be a little more exciting. So I think it's great. What you should study while here. So I kind of think,
besides taking your class, which was oversubscribed, so apologies to those of you who couldn't get it there.
I think you should take the classes that interest you and figure out how the things that interest you are going to be impacted by these technologies. So, for example, copyright is a very obvious one to go. Figure out how music rights work, because they're not going to change anytime soon. And then think about, all right, in light of any optimism I might have about blockchain technology and crypto, how can I get involved in, like, for example, a startup or even a big company who's interested in using crypto consistent with IP law? So you need to have that background to be involved in that. Likewise, you could just take a securities class. We have a lecturer here, Eric Schwartz, who offers one. You could take a securities class and get involved there, because I actually think the securities laws and how they're interpreted and what we do over the next 10 years is going to be a huge driver of what this space looks like. Can you have a stock market of songs? And if you can, under what terms? And does Congress...
Can you give us that word that you just said and tell everybody who doesn't know what it is?
Which word?
A stock market of blank.
Oh, songs.
Which means...
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, if you want to bet on
Urban Dictionary,
if you want to bet on a Bob Dylan song and buy the revenue stream,
songs,
yeah, exactly. So, what needs to change in the securities laws, or how do you do it consistent with current securities laws? There's a policy angle there. There's a law and compliance angle there. So I think just go to the classes you think are interesting. Take corporations, and then figure out how DAOs fit into this. And if you're a part of that, I think you're going to be a part of something very meaningful over the next 10 years.
And how much technical knowledge do they need? Or should they focus on getting a good black letter education in copyright, securities, corporations, and the other key subjects here?
I think
contracts, presumably.
You need to understand the basics of how crypto works. So you need to understand, for example, in Bitcoin, who the miners are. Because if you don't understand who the miners are, and you want to regulate the miners, for like sanctions compliance or something, you're going to do what Congress did last year, which is they passed a law that made no sense whatsoever. And I can get into that if you like, but basically reflected, I think, a lack of understanding as to who the miners are in the Bitcoin protocol, and therefore how to regulate them.
Are there some areas, we may have some students who are thinking about notes, are there some topics at the bleeding edge that need to be explored in the legal world that you think might be good areas for them to think about?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential student notes to write here. And really any area of interest allows for them. Like, so let's just say you're interested in like legal philosophy. You know, the legal realism take on securities laws, for example, is more interesting now than I think it's been in a long time. You know, what is the law? Is it what's in the Securities Act from the 30s, or is it in the speeches that these commissioners are giving, the noises they make, the enforcement actions they take, and people reading in between the lines, and the ramifications for law by administrative state? You know, it's always been there, but now it has a very profound effect on how folks in the industry who want to comply act. And it has a very profound effect on business models. So if you're interested in legal realism, you know, I was like interested in legal formalism. So all of this is like, I'm conceding that legal realists had an interesting point. And I think that's for example, something someone could write. Just to throw out another example, there's this concept called the third party doctrine. So under the Bank Secrecy Act, right now, Congress requires banks to report all sorts of things, including, for example, transactions over $10,000. They have your social security number. They're keeping all this data about you. And it is functionally a surveillance state on finance, right? We know what's happening because of the Bank Secrecy Act. The offered justification under the Constitution for why we have this enormous surveillance state with no warrants is the third party doctrine. Third party doctrine says, okay, well, you handed over your finances to this third party, you gave up privacy, we can do it. What happens if you remove the third party? You no longer have a third party doctrine, unless you're going to hinge it on the minors. So one note could be why you can hinge it on the minors. Another note could say, you can't. And let's take it a step further. Can the state require you to use a financial intermediary, even though there are these decentralized options with no intermediary? On the theory, that's the only way we can regulate you. The constitutional implication of that, I think, is fairly obvious, which is to say they're requiring you to do something just to get you in a place where they can surveil you.
And there's a parallel here in the debate over encryption, which is something that we talk about in national security law a lot. Can the state force you to record your thoughts and your messages in a manner that will be amenable to surveillance upon the appropriate legal process? Okay, so before we go on, since this is a law school, I want to ask you about the Constitution Dao. Then we're going to move to questions from the audience. Tell us about the Constitution Dao. What is it? The Wikipedia entry for people who don't know what it is. Your involvement in it, and what lessons do you think it has?
So the Constitution Dao was a grassroots effort to raise money to buy a copy of the Constitution that was on sale at Sotheby's. I got involved upon hearing about it because I was concerned. I was like, what are these people going to do with the Constitution? The Constitution is a sacred document to our country. Like, who are these people? And so I got on what we call the Discord. I don't know if you guys use Discord. Raise your hand if you use Discord. Okay, so it's basically like a forum in which people can like Slack, exchange messages, kind of. And it's a preferred forum for crypto. I got into the Discord and I found out who some of the leaders were. And like I said, you know, these leaders they looked into the LLC concept. And they started it. They kind of organized a lot of it. And I found out that they actually want to just place it in a public setting as like a win for the people. And I, having clerked on the court, thought, what better public setting than the public session of the Supreme Court? So I reached out to the Supreme Court to let them know this was potentially happening, and if it was, would this be interesting to them? It turned out the DAO was outbid by billionaire founder of Citadel. So it didn't work, but it proved, I think.
Could there possibly be a starker contrast there? A scrappy group of grassroots activists outbid by the billionaire hedge fund founder who's going to put it in his basement or something.
Well, no, to his credit, it's going to a museum started by the Walton family. So I think it's going to be in Bentonville.
Okay.
So thankfully, the public will have access to it. But it proved the organizing force of these DAOs. And part of that is
how much were they able to bid in the end?
I believe it was about 42 million, something like that.
Do you know what was the largest individual pledge?
I don't know.
Was there one individual who put a huge amount in, or was it all small?
I think that there were these like whales who put in bigger checks, but there were a lot of small checks. There were a lot of
But not checks. How did people commit their money? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so you buy, so with your fiat, you'll buy one.
Fiat is like your US dollar that you carry in your wallet.
With your US dollars, you'll buy a crypto and then use that crypto to swap into their token. And then that's how they're raising their money. What was interesting to me is that I think without this Constitution Dao, the sale price of the Constitution was likely going to be a lot less. Like it was bid up to over $40 million. And, you know, one narrative as well, kind of a bubble, kind of this one-time thing. Another narrative, which I think is more likely to be right, or at least is right enough, is that there's a certain enjoyment that people have in ownership. And these assets, especially art and cultural artifacts that are sold by places like Sotheby's, have heretofore been constrained to this group of wealthy buyers. You're now increasing the pool of demand by giving access to the crowds, right? And so the actual market clearing price is higher. Now, why is it higher? One theory is, okay, there's more people bidding, demand goes up, right? I think that's totally probably right. Another access is that there's like more fun to it. Now, with the Constitution, you might say, okay, well, you know, what's the fun to it? You just kind of own like a little piece of a DAO that has an LLC that owns the Constitution. What's the point? I think sometimes it's worth kind of like envisioning a future. Imagine if you could buy a sports team, and you could have a DAO that allows fans to own a sports team and to vote on governance, vote on who to draft, vote on key decisions. All of a sudden, I would submit the value of sports teams would go up very significantly, because just like fantasy football, you add this element on top of just viewing. So people go from viewing to participating. What's the participating premium? You know, I think the market will tell if they're allowed. Is that interesting to you? Guess what? Securities law is very big problem. That's why I think it's interesting to study the securities laws and to be a part of that policy conversation.
That's great. Okay, let's take some questions. Professor Chesney.
So the blockchain depends on processing power, and as this proliferates, we're going to need more power, and that processing power is growing electricity, presents a significant and growing environmental issue. How big a deal is this? Is this overstated? There's some who say it's a huge problem. Is it?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's worth getting a little bit deeper into the protocols here. There's a proof of work protocol which uses electricity. That's providing the server power.
And what proof of work is I solved a really hard math problem, therefore I'm trustworthy to record this block. And that costs a lot of electricity.
Yeah, the origin of proof of work is actually anti-spam. Before you send an email, do this puzzle, which requires you to spend money on electricity. So if you're going to spam 1 million people, all of a sudden it becomes costly, right? Same concept here. Before you submit some like block in a transaction, why don't you spend a little bit of resources so we know you're not just like sending out endless garbage, right? And we'll proceed that way. Proof of stake is the latest innovation that Ethereum is trying to transition to, where instead of saying the miner who solves the puzzle gets to do the transaction, we just say you get to do the transaction as a function of how many resources you've staked into the protocol. So let's just say you put in 10 ETH into the protocol. That over the denominator of all staked ETH is the number of times you will get to submit a transaction. And if you lie in your transaction and others catch it, you get slashed and you lose what you staked. In that model, you don't need to solve this unnecessary puzzle. Advocates of proof of stake would say you can just only expend the electricity needed to do the transaction, which it turns out is a small fraction of the electricity used for these things.
Because you have shown that you have so much skin in the game that it's very unlikely that you would destroy the network because you would erase your own stake.
That's right.
That's why you're trustworthy then.
That's right. That's right. Now, proof of work has its own advantages, and I don't think a lot of folks thought Bitcoin would grow as fast as it did. So this is like it's like a good problem to have and a new problem to have. But one of the advantages, obviously, is like the distributional consequences. You know, when it started, people plugged in their laptops, started earning Bitcoin, and all around the world. And you didn't have to be rich; you have to put up resources up front. You can earn them by contributing your laptop's used power.
And I think people have said Bitcoin uses as much electricity as Argentina, just to give people a sense of maybe it's Uruguay, one of those, as a non-trivial country with a reasonable economy. So that's a lot of electricity, a lot of potential emissions. What about the theory that Bitcoin is a way of storing energy in the form of money so that it can be used later? This is an argument people make about renewable power. Have you heard that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, this concept of flaring, right? When they flare natural gas, they're using it for nothing. Why not use it to create Bitcoin? That's an obvious one. I think renewable mining is an obvious one. Another interesting technical innovation is this concept of proof of necessary work. So instead of doing a random puzzle, you're doing work that is helpful for computations elsewhere, right? I have to say that I don't love comparing like Bitcoin to like sovereign nations, because it's sort of like saying, well, it's just, it's hard. You have to know about like the sovereign nation. You're talking about almost $1 trillion network here. So what is the GDP of the country you're comparing it to? What is it doing? So it gets a little bit complicated. One thing, like one fallacy that I see like repeated, like again, I think the environmental concerns are really, really important. The one fallacy I see repeated is saying like a per transaction cost of energy, which basically amortizes the entire Bitcoin network, each transaction, and then comparing that to like a Visa swipe on a marginal cost. It's like, in the long run, what do we think costs more energy? Having all of Visa's buildings, all of Visa's infrastructure, and employees driving to work and back and all this stuff versus an algorithm. I'm a little bit skeptical that long run, this is an environmental negative, but I think those concerns are really important and are putting helpful pressure on this new industry to address our environmental concerns.
And it's probably fair to say that they're important to governments, which aren't necessarily so friendly to crypto anyway. So if this problem isn't solved, governments will come in and take it as an opportunity or a necessary opportunity to do something about it.
Just an added perspective, given your experience with setting up a startup in blockchain, can you give us a sense of the timing at which you think that this all might unfold? I've read one place where the banks and others are setting up consortiums that are already commercializing. Can you give us a sense of how fast it might take off?
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, the feel it has to me, and I choose that word very deliberately because this is how I feel about it, is like slow then fast. What do I mean by that? I mean, I think like e-commerce, once the internet was around the early 90s, was obvious, but the cryptography necessary and the policy that allowed people to use cryptography that secured transactions took a while, right? So these little developments in the cryptography and also policy are hugely enabling or disabling. That's why I think we're sitting in a big moment from a law and policy perspective. So let's just say the people who are doing cryptography, the computer scientists, they're going to do a good job. They're going to move forward. The law and policy people need to be thinking about how do we enable innovation and how do we address the concerns we have. And if we don't address the concerns that we have, then we're going to have terrible use cases, which then get everyone upset at crypto, and then we kind of backlash the other way, right? So I think we have to police the frauds, the scams. We have to address our policy concerns. At the same time, if we don't enable innovation, because we keep saying, well, it's not fitting into the way we were regulating 20 years ago, then I think we're going to have this missed opportunity. We're just going to wait around, right? And cryptography in the 90s is a great example. The government taking the view that it's a national security concern for anyone to have cryptography, right? That's why we had HTTP before we had the S. That delayed e-commerce for sure, right?
Because people didn't want to put their credit card details in to a website that could be stolen.
Of course. And I think over and over again, we see this, the governments desire to say, okay, why don't you let us have a back door, right? Why don't you let us have the, not recognizing that, like, okay, that works for your interests, but you've also opened up a huge security hole elsewhere that's going to affect how people think about risks they take, right?
Students, all you holders out there, you've got skin in the game. Yep.
So I don't know a ton about this, but I mean, I pay attention to notice that there's some fairly prominent people who criticize the decentralization aspect of blockchain with Web 3.0 more broadly, saying that it's not really going to be as decentralized. The decentralization is kind of hype. Really, you're going to get some big players like already with NFTs. You see OpenSea really dominating that. How do you kind of address people like that?
Well, I think they make a really good point. I mean, I think the question is, where is decentralization an asset? Where is it important? Where is it not? I think ultimately we will be comfortable with centralized parties doing a lot of things for us. National security is a great example. Policing is a great example, right? We're not trying to decentralize the entire everything that people do. So the question is, where is it helpful? And where can we rely on third parties?
How do the creators and the designers of the algorithm powering the blockchains ensure its security? I mean, if the digital ledger is essentially just a bunch of ones and zeros, then how do you prevent hackings and stuff like that?
Yeah, the code itself for something like Bitcoin has to be secure. And if someone finds an insecurity in any of these codes, they can exploit it. And you need to have a robust open source community that's constantly kicking the tire and constantly ready to upgrade against kind of malicious actors. So on that front, you're talking, like, again, Bitcoin, almost $1 trillion. I don't know what the market cap is now, but hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap. There's a lot of incentive for someone to come around looking to steal. Its ability to withstand that thus far is, I think, kind of an amazing achievement.
Kind of building off that question, you talked earlier a little bit about the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. And, do you have any concerns about proof of stake and the ability of a deep-pocketed bad actor essentially, buying a majority stake and being able to alter that ledger to their benefit?
Yeah, the game theory there is more complicated. So first of all, I think I should note that if you're, let's just say, endlessly deep-pocketed bad actor, you could buy all the servers in the world and technically and kind of become the primary miner on Bitcoin and take it over. The costs of doing that are extremely prohibitive for these big networks. But the game theory is actually an interesting part of the answer, which is to say, let's say some government is like, we're going to buy a bunch of servers and take down Bitcoin. Well, okay, you're going to take control of Bitcoin, but then the value is going to collapse because people are like, I don't want to be a part of this network anymore. So you attack a network, the very thing that you're buying, you're devaluing. So attacks on networks, I think, have to balance what are they putting in and what are they getting out of the attack. That's why I'm not particularly surprised to see the attacks are more focused on like stealing other people's stuff than they are on actually devaluing the network. That's not to say the network shouldn't think about that, because maybe a country wants to, undermine Bitcoin for other reasons and is willing to spend the money to do that. But it's part of the calculus.
When we talk of crypto and Bitcoin blockchain, usually terms like Bitcoin, these big coins, the proof or the more reputed ones. But what about the new ones coming up? Isn't there right now must be 400 or maybe 4,000 plus coins? They might be having the same technology and all, but someone, like, how do you know that when someone comes out with something, it's not maybe a multi-level marketing Ponzi scheme kind of thing? So
yeah,
making a comparison to consider it in share market, there are a certain number of shares. Let's not talk about whether they can be manipulated or not, whether prices do get manipulated. And that is happening in Bitcoin or for that matter other cryptos also. So is some sense of just because it is open and transparent, does it make that fair?
No, and I think if you don't understand the code, then you don't understand what you're investing in. So if someone you trust doesn't understand the code, then it's like, what can you outsource? At this point, when you're thinking about Bitcoin, you've outsourced to, decade plus worth of people kicking the tires around this thing, people who have a lot of incentive to break it, and that's all you're trusting. That doesn't mean it's enough. It doesn't mean that next year someone might not find something. If you're not technical, you don't understand it, you're just sitting there relying on other people, right? And people who are technical can look at Bitcoin and say, you know what, I trust this. This makes sense.
There's also the question of utility in the world. How do you think about that? Right. So we can look at a particular blockchain, particular project, and say this has some utility in the world. This is doing something, or this is just a speculative coin. Is that the right way to look at it?
My view is top-down determinations of utility are very hard.
Well, even or as a market actor, as someone who might want to buy something.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're let's say you're an investor in the space. Now this is investment advice, obviously. If you're an investor in the space, you need to have a sense of why does this thing have value. So most of us, especially in law school, maybe we're a little more risk averse. You look at a picture of a bored monkey, and you're like, I don't understand why I would spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars on a picture of a bored monkey. Okay, and that is a reasonable assessment. There are other people who joined that community. They built it into the meme it is, and that meme is now doing partnerships with Adidas. Because why? Because brand value matters. And this concept of influencers that we've all gotten accustomed to over the past 10 years with like Instagram's business model will extend to digital assets. Digital things like pictures will have intangible value that can be marketed to companies. How you value that, the answer to it, you should go into investing. Be in venture, because that's really, really hard. And I think, to me, it's like put a caution tape around that entire thing. You're entering there, you're doing it at your own risk, because it's not like valuing cash flows of a business. It's Wild West.
More over there.
I think one of the big promise of blockchain is the data privacy protection.
Sorry, can you be a little louder?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I think one of the promise of blockchain is data privacy protection. And but there's a lot of conflicts between the data protection and the state surveillance or the platform data, which their revenue model is driven by the data capitalism. So how do you see, for example, like DM, the Facebook's cryptocurrency, that has been constrained by Americans Congress by claiming it's not comply with the money laundering policy or KYC. So how do you see the tension between the blockchain actors who claim to protect the data privacy and the surveillance foundations for the big tech?
Yeah, I think privacy is one of the most interesting and underrated problems with crypto. Everything we've talked about so far is on a public blockchain. The only thing protecting your privacy is the fact that your public key on Bitcoin, for example, so your public key is what? It's like your address. It's where people will send you Bitcoin. Your public key on its face does not have your name. So it takes a little bit of sort of surveillance work that companies like Chainalysis do, where they start linking public keys with identities. Once that's done, and that's I think inevitable, that ultimately people will have a very good sense of who these public keys belong to. Once that's done, you basically have no privacy whatsoever. So any transactions relating to your public keys are going to be totally out there. And if you ever thought, wow, the bored monkeys did well, the bored apes did really well, I'm going to buy a bored giraffe, but the bored giraffes didn't do well, everyone's going to know that you made that silly investment. Or if you want to use crypto to go see a doctor and pay your doctor down the line, everyone's going to know, your insurance company is going to know that you just saw a doctor. This is a very significant privacy issue. Now, again, hypothetical authoritarian governments will love this. They'll think it's really, really important. There will be crypto, and there are right now.
About that. China is issuing a central bank digital currency. So this is a tokenized renminbi that's on the blockchain. What does that enable them to do compared to now? How is it different from now? Because of course we have digital dollars that we use all over the place.
I think now cash is is your most private option.
Let's forget about cash though.
And I think the state's ability to see your credit card information is sort of limited to certain kinds of transactions, certain individuals that it wants to monitor. With the blockchain, anything you're doing can be monitored by everyone. And so the amount of intention, it's sort of like, one law analogy is like going from like jury trials are public 200 years ago to jury trials are televised, right? All of a sudden, you have a lot of access to something. And with access comes like incentive to analyze. With incentive to analyze comes like understandings about who you are. So if you're concerned about what Facebook was doing with your data in terms of what you're clicking on, what you buy is, I think, a very rich source of information about who you are. So that to me is very concerning. I think there are cryptographic solutions. So Zcash is like a version of Bitcoin that hashes, which obfuscates your transactions so that people cannot see from who to who and how much money. The company I'm working at is trying to figure out privacy solutions for smart contracts. So like kind of a Ethereum, but with private capacity. And then once you move here,
so you can run these self-executing contracts without the counterparties having to know who one another is, but still being able to trust each other.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Zcash, very simple. If you use Venmo, you can do it public or private. You can send money so that it's broadcast to the whole world, or you can do it privately. Right now on blockchains, generally speaking, none of that's private. Zcash allows you to do a private option. Now, if you start doing smart contracts, a little bit more involved. Again, like in the real world right now, if any of us sign a contract between the two of us, it's just between the two of us. It doesn't, maybe like for tax reasons, you send something to the IRS, but generally speaking, they're private. My company is working on solutions that would allow that as well. Now, then you go from the government's, like here, for example, the government's going to have a legitimate interest in protecting people's privacy. We see that in all sorts of laws. We move over to, now the government's worried about sort of money laundering, sanctions, violations, things like that. And there are a lot of ways to foster compliance while protecting privacy. I think the very easiest is regulating the on-ramps, right? The on-ramps are where you change your US dollar to some other cryptocurrency. So if you're like, let's say you're money laundering. So, $300 billion drug market out there, and they want to take some chunk of that and put it into a crypto. You are onboarding a bunch of money somewhere that is a regulated third party for the most part, whether it's Coinbase, Gemini, Kraken, whatever, and that money is going to show up on the radar. So it's actually a little bit hard to do it. And I think that's the most promising place for governments to be monitoring the money laundering aspect. The other things you can do is, with the same cryptography, you can provide viewing keys that assure compliance. So for example, let's say Visa or PayPal or any of these companies wants to have some like stable coin, they want to have some coin that moves around, they can make it so that somebody in their compliance department has a viewing key for certain elements of the transaction, the size or whatever. So you limit the data leakage as opposed to putting all out there. And then another option, obviously, is like blacklisting, finding addresses that shouldn't be there and blacklisting them. So it depends. And for some of those solutions, you need a centralized third party. Some of them you don't. You can put it literally into the code. That answers your question.
With the Howey test billing on Bitcoin and Ethereum, the common enterprise part, SEC has mentioned, and CFTC has also claimed it to be a commodity. So when you have so many different coins and it's difficult to distinguish what is a security and what is a commodity, and CFTC and SEC, both of them trying to have it under them, Coinbase suggested to have a separate regulation entity formed to regulate cryptocurrencies. What do you think is the solution to? Is it forming another organization, or should it be separated between CFTC and SEC?
I think Congress needs to get involved. And I think Congress needs to hear out from all the different perspectives to figure out how it best wants to regulate this. The issue with having the SEC regulate it, some parts of what the SEC does, this is very natural fit. You have people raising money, they're raising money with promise to build something, and it's a very standard investment contract. Some parts of this, especially the decentralized elements where there's nobody there, like there's no CEO of Bitcoin, right, don't fit cleanly into the Securities Acts. So the Securities Acts were designed to make sure that companies that have information disclose that information on a regular basis. They're registered, they're sharing stuff, so there's not, people are kind of kept apprised of what's going on, they can make determinations. Bitcoin doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have a CEO. It has nothing other than what's publicly available, and what's publicly available is everything. So you need some regulatory status for this, and for projects that aspire to be this. I mean, I think it'd be strange if we said Bitcoin's the last, or Ethereum, or whatever the last company is, there's a last blockchain that can be kind of launched without holding the original team kind of like forever accountable, even though they don't have insider information anymore. Like, this is just not what the securities laws were designed to do. Part of it is, and part of it isn't. So I think you need a new congressional mandate. I think one of the problems is, securities regulators are tasked with finding violations of securities laws. They're not tasked with encouraging innovation. They're not tasked with all sorts of other considerations that Congress is well positioned to think about. And so putting them in the position of, here's the new asset class, we're not telling you anything, it may be under your purview, it may not be under your purview, I think is an uncomfortable position for them. I think they need more clarity.
Maybe we should collect the last two questions here, and then you can answer them both at the same time, because we're coming up on time.
So I can see why a country like China is very interested in utilizing blockchain technology, but what would be the case, in your expertise, your opinion, for a country like El Salvador to adopt Bitcoin as a legal tender and utilize it?
Yeah, mine probably get a little easier. If you didn't get into your class because it was overbooked, what kind of resources, like what do you recommend? Books, websites, podcasts? What are you looking at daily to kind of keep up on this stuff?
Great. Okay, so first, why did El Salvador adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, and then what resources are available to learn about this?
Yeah, I can't speak to El Salvador's motivations specifically, but it seems like some combination of a bet on Bitcoin. So, they're investing sovereign money, sovereign resources into Bitcoin, and the value goes up, they're going to partake in that wealth. So whether that's a sensible bet from a sovereign nation or not, I think subject to debate, but that's certainly part of what they're doing. The other part is, look, we take for granted having a stable financial system here. And a lot of other countries have been experimenting with pegs to US dollars, pegs to other, should it be gold backed, should it not be gold backed? This is just the latest experiment. Whether it ends well or doesn't end well, I mean, if you have an opinion, great thing to write about. And then in terms of other resources, right now it's generally felt a little bit early for the books. I think there are books coming out. There's a book on the history of Ethereum. There's a book on DeFi that kind of lays it out. I generally have found podcasts and Twitter and some of the new publications to be more interesting. Obviously, the folks on the podcast, largely speaking, will have biases, like a venture capitalist talking about why it's a great asset class they're investing in. But I think that comes from a place of conviction, and they've identified these trends up front. So they have been very kind of resourceful in explaining why you should be interested.
I'm going to give three. First of all, Professor Kian's Medium posts on this are very good, so go to those. And then you want to give three other names that they can look for on Twitter or online?
Yeah, I think Chris Dixon at A16Z is someone that I've learned a lot from. Then there are Nick Szabo, who's a computer scientist with a legal background, who talked about smart contracts in the mid-90s. So if you look up podcasts including him, Katie Hahn is on a couple of podcasts where she describes her law to venture background. She was one of the prosecutors on some of the early misuses of Bitcoin. There's a lot. I think you'll go down, people call it a rabbit hole. You're going to go down this rabbit hole of resources. And once you start following along, you'll notice there are some others who are saying some interesting stuff. And you'll also notice that a lot of people have like a lot of different views on why this is successful. You know, you've got everything from people who I think 50 years ago would have been gold enthusiasts, you know, kind of a libertarian back. They don't trust the government. They want this. And then you got people who, for example, will think about like the Uber example, and they'll be very excited about the distributional consequences of that. And, you know, obviously in a society where we've been given a lot of reasons to mistrust like big tech companies, disintermediating them and having with actual competitors as opposed to, you know, outdated antitrust policy. Like, how do you break up Facebook? What does that even mean? But having competition, bootstrapping social networks through crypto, you know, you'll find all of these interesting explanations, and you'll have to decide for yourself which ones make sense to you, which ones are just kind of like foisting a narrative on technology as it's happening. And I think that process is a lot of fun.
Okay, well, when you start referring to your US dollars as fiat, you'll know that you've read enough and that you're truly an insider. Thank you, Sina Kian. This was great. Really enjoyed it.